My name is Sanoop Nambiar. I'm the program manager from the Mondo and AusNet teams on the trial. And today, the intent is to go through the customer insights, the initial study out and its outcomes from the work undertaken by the team from Deakin. And we've got Professor Josh Newton, Assistant Professor, Associate Dean of Research, Josh Newton from Deakin University, to take us through the slide pack, calling out some of the interesting things that they found. Now, just for context, the EDGE trial has just completed milestone 3 successfully. As many of you might be aware, while a lot of what we are trying to do has a technical, highly technical in some instances aspect to it, we're all, from day one, we've all been keenly aware that any sort of DER marketplace type arrangements will only succeed if we understand and give end users and customers what they're looking for from such an arrangement. That's where the customer insights piece is central to what we want to understand and sort of communicate so that policy makers and regulators can use that in how the NEM evolves. So with that being said, I might quickly just pass on to Josh. The slides are up, so Josh, if you want to kick it off, please go for it.
Lovely. Thank you, Anoop, and welcome everyone to this webinar. What I'd like to do before I get started is just to acknowledge all the various partners that have been helping us with this research. Without all of their active involvement and participation, we wouldn't have been able to do the insights work that we've been able to produce. So to call out particularly AEMO and the wonderful team that we've been able to work with along Mondo and AusNet Services, and then also the researchers that have been supporting me from Deakin University. Now, before I get into the webinar, I would just like to do a brief acknowledgement of country. This is an image taken just a few kilometres away from where I am currently presenting. I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and so would like to briefly acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land of which I am presenting and to recognise their leaders past, present and emerging as well. A couple of housekeeping matters before we get into the webinar proper. First of all, you'll probably have seen from the team site that the presentation is being recorded for those who are unable to attend today, and the recording will be made available up on the AEMO website shortly. So if you need to duck off at any stage, or if you've got colleagues that would be potentially interested in the findings that I'll be going through, please direct them to the AEMO website once the webinar recording is up. There's also going to be an opportunity at the end of the webinar for questions and answers. So if you do put anything in the chat box, I will look at that at the very end of the webinar, and then also happy to answer questions live if you're wanting to put your hand up at the very end. So just a very brief overview. I think that everyone here is probably well and truly familiar with what Project EDGE is all about, but effectively for those that don't have perhaps quite as much of an overview, it's very much a proof of concept trial, looking at what do we need to do to try to introduce a market-based trading mechanism so that once customers have energy resources such as batteries and rooftop solar and are able to interact with electricity services like an aggregator, to what extent is that market-based trading mechanism able to work? And what we were particularly interested in is around the perceptions and the decision-making processes that existed among 3 discrete groups. Potential residential customers. So these are customers that are potential customers for signing up to these types of programs, but they haven't actually signed up yet. So they're very much in that hypothetical state of mind. Also interested in understanding current residential battery owners, so those that have signed up to Project Edge, and really trying to unpick and understand the reasons why they had signed up, and also what some of their initial perceptions were about Project Edge and the experience with battery ownership more broadly. And then to also look at potential organizational customers, because obviously this isn't focused exclusively around residential customers. There's also the potential for businesses and for local government agencies and for other organizational customers to sign up as well. And so we're really interested in further understanding that particular segment. So the focus for today's webinar will be looking at some of the findings that we've produced around each of these particular segments. As Anoop mentioned, this is very much a Cliff Notes overview for the research. There's lots of things that we've incorporated into the report that won't be that we won't have a time or chance to cover in this webinar. So if you are interested in further understanding the findings and some of the more nuanced outcomes that we've been able to generate, I really do encourage you to look at the reports and to go through and delve into some of the detail that we've been able to provide there. And if there are any questions that you've got after reading those reports, more than happy to answer those as well. So in terms of the first piece of research, looking at potential residential customers, what we did is conducted a survey looking at almost 400 participants who were residing across regional and rural Victoria. Most of our participants sat outside of the larger population centres that we were looking at. So we had about 20% or so of participants residing in Geelong, 19% residing across the broader Hume region. And we were calling this out particularly in the research because that's an area where Mondo and AusNet are focusing some of their initial work for Project Edge around that Hume region. So we're really keen to understand perceptions there. And then about 8% in Shepparton. So the rest of our participants were located across the remainder of regional and rural Victoria. Before I proceed into the results proper and to describe a little bit more of the sample, just wanted to make a note that when we were going through and doing the analyses, we were very interested in understanding whether there were potential variations across these population centres in terms of their perceptions, in terms of their awareness and attitudes more broadly, and we didn't find any. And so I think that this is really interesting to demonstrate that at a really high level, we aren't seeing dramatic variations from one region to another. And that's not to say that there are no differences, but certainly for those really broader level issues that we're looking at, things like awareness, things like intention to join, things like broader attitudes, we weren't seeing dramatic variations across each of those regional areas. A little bit more of an overview of the sample that we were able to recruit. We had almost a third of participants with rooftop solar panels who were installed, which broadly approximates what would be sort of seen across the broader Australian population. We had 2% who were owning a household battery, and we had a little over half of our participants who didn't have any of those particular forms of technology that are often integral to a distributed energy resource type setup. We also had almost half of our participants who reported experiencing either common or major power disruptions. And I really wanted to call this particular statistic out because we'll refer to it in a few slides' time when we're starting to look at some of the potential segments who might be interested in adopting this type of technology. So first of all, into the broader awareness. Now, as you'll see, we were looking at awareness around virtual power plants. We were focusing particularly around that terminology because that's the terminology that's starting to be used in some of the community outreach activities that Mondo's been doing within the Hume region. Now, VPPs are one way of describing this technology. DERs would obviously be another. And so given that there is sometimes a degree of interchangeability within those terms, within the way it's sometimes described more broadly, it may partly explain why awareness wasn't especially high. That being said, when we're looking at broader awareness for VPPs and Project Edge, we had virtually over 90% of our participants who were either not aware of either of those terms or who were aware of them, but didn't really know anything about them. And I think that this provides both some cautionary notes, but also some opportunities as well for the agencies that are working in this particular space. From a note of caution, we understand from a broader marketing decision-making perspective that unless people are aware of particular products or services, they're not going to be able to adopt them. Awareness is one of those fundamental characteristics which is required and which is pretty much foundational before a person is able to form opinions and then to start to develop intentions to adopt particular technologies. So we really need to try and find ways of being able to bolster awareness for VPPs, for Project Edge, for this broader set of technologies within the community. Without that, it's going to be very hard to increase the adoption of this form of technology within the community. From a note of optimism though, because awareness is so low, it does give us the opportunity, and this is effectively a one-time only opportunity, to be able to effectively brand what VPPs look like among people within the community. It's not like we're having to combat or to deal with existing sets of perceptions, and so it does provide an opportunity for first movers in this space to paint a really compelling picture about what this technology can represent, and also why consumers of all particular flavors and shapes, whether they are residential, whether they are CNI, whether they are within government, to really be looking at adopting this form of technology. We were anticipating when we were designing our survey instrument that awareness was going to be low. And so what we did is, after presenting that awareness question and understanding whether people were aware or not of VPPs, we provided a very brief description so that we could make sure that everyone was approaching the subsequent questions that we were able to present with at least some degree of background knowledge. When we were designing this overview, we were very conscious of trying to minimize to the greatest extent possible complex terminology, complex terms. And so we were using some of the algorithms to identify reading level to make sure that this was being pitched at a year 9 or year 10 reading level. We were also, as you'll see here, trying to not be too overly enthusiastic with presenting and framing the description. We're trying to provide as neutral as possible description of what a VPP can do and deliver, while still at the same time presenting various overviews of the attributes and benefits associated with this technology. And the final note that I'll make before moving on to the next set of findings is that we didn't provide any information in this overview around the cost of joining a VPP. When we were doing this particular piece of research, the costs weren't 100% understood from a Mondo perspective. And at the same time, we've also got additional pieces of research that we're currently conducting with Mondo, which are delving into that particular issue in a far greater level of detail. And so for all of those reasons, we didn't actually incorporate specific price points into this overview. So once participants had had a chance to read through this overview, we then started to ask them questions to identify what their opinion was for VPPs, as well as also their interest in joining a VPP like Project Edge. And here are the results placed side by side. And I presented them side by side because I think that there's a really interesting dynamic at play here. When we're looking at it from a perceptual point of view, so in other words, what people's opinions are of Project Edge and VPPs, we can really see that participants were either somewhat or extremely positive about this technology. We've got almost 2/3 that were indicating somewhat or extremely positive opinions about Project Edge. And that's, I think, a really gratifying and interesting set of findings. What we also did, though, is ask participants what their interest would be in potentially joining Project Edge. And here we start to see a slightly different dynamic, where we've got about half of participants who recorded being not at all or only slightly interested. And we've got about 1/4 of our participants who recorded being either very or extremely interested in joining. Now, this dynamic is interesting for a couple of reasons, and we can interpret this from both a glass half full perspective as well as also a glass half empty perspective. From a glass half full perspective, it's really interesting to see that we were able to have almost 1/4 of our participants who, and if we think back just a couple of slides ago, the overwhelming majority of our participants were not aware of this technology. They didn't really know a huge amount about it. So we've got about 1/4 of our participants who were either very or extremely interested in joining after reading just that very short overview that we presented a couple of slides ago. So that's the glass half full look at this particular finding, that after very small exposure to some information about this technology, we had 1/4 of participants who were very or extremely interested in joining. From a glass half empty perspective, however, we understand from broader marketing and behavioral decision-making contexts that a person who might intend to do something or might be interested in doing something doesn't always translate into actual behavior. This is known as the intention behavior gap, and very much describes situations where a person might have incredibly high intentions to do something, but it doesn't necessarily translate into automatic behavior or action to do the things consistent with that intention. And I think that that's a dynamic that would probably start to see for Project Edge as well. If we have about a quarter of our participants who were very or extremely interested in joining, only a proportion of those would ultimately go on to join. So this is something I think that really is an element that we all have to grapple with as we're starting to think about how we frame and pitch elements like Project Edge and other VPPs to customers. What is it that we need to do to really try to develop the most attractive value propositions so that we can really maximize the number of people who are very or extremely interested in joining to actually go ahead and to undertake the adoption behaviors necessary for them to take advantage of this technology. And some of the insights that we'll be presenting over the current or the next few slides will hopefully give at least glimmers of what that might start to look like. Now, after asking around for participants' opinion and interest in joining, we then undertook a set of analyses to get a better handle of the socio-demographic profile of customers who might be particularly interested in joining. We were really interested in trying to paint as comprehensive a picture as possible, while at the same time also using variables that can be externally referenced or made use of by organizations who are looking to encourage people to join their VPPs or to join Project Edge. And so I'll go through each of these results in turn and also briefly elaborate upon how organizations can potentially leverage these findings to really try to target those people that have a really higher than normal interest in adopting VPPs like Project Edge. The very first variable that you can see there is around age. We've got a negative finding for older age. And what this effectively means is that participants who were younger had or reported a greater interest in joining Project Edge. We also found that participants who had a university background, a university educational background, were also more likely to express an interest in joining Project Edge. Now, both of these findings are interesting and they probably point to a relatively similar underlying explanation for why these two factors were coming up. Participants who are younger, participants who are university educated are often a little bit more technologically proficient or at the same time have a slightly greater confidence in engaging with newer forms of technology. And that could potentially explain why those two particular groupings were a little bit more likely to express an interest in joining. From a targeting perspective, organizations can really try to leverage the census data and really zooming in on some of those really narrowly defined statistical regions that the ABS uses to form their census data or to report their census data, to identify those geographic regions of particular communities that are a little bit younger than normal or a little bit more likely to be university educated than normal. And that could provide a basis for being able to reach out and to target individuals that might be interested in joining VPPs like Project Edge. We also found that participants
There was a question from Kevin about what the beta value represents.
Yep. So the beta value represents the strength of the association. The higher the number, the stronger the association at a broad level. So the higher the number, the more important it is. And if we were to have a look, for example, at age, we can see that we've got a really high beta value, which means that that's a little bit stronger as a predictor for interest in joining relative to something like having common or major power outages, which had a lower beta value. So it's just very much a way to be able to understand the importance, the strength of that association between the segmentation variable and the variables that we're looking at in terms of favorable opinion and interest in joining.
Yeah, sorry, I'm familiar with regression analysis. I'm just wondering which type of regression did you use? Is that like equivalent to percentage difference, or did you use, you know, which? That's what I was getting at.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no,
absolutely. Yeah, so we were using multiple regression analysis to undertake these results. We had a continuous variable for favorable opinion and interest in joining. So the form of regression analysis that we're using was multiple regression analysis, if that answers your question.
So it was linear?
Linear, yes. Yep.
Linear, okay. All right, thank you.
So in terms of progressive political values, we found that participants who had or who reported having a more progressive political outlook were more likely to express an interest in joining and also to have a more favourable opinion around VPPs like Project Edge. And I think that this probably characterises the politicisation that we've seen of renewable energy technologies in particular over the last decade or so, and potentially explains why those that expressed having a more progressive political viewpoint were more interested in joining Project Edge. Again, in terms of being able to leverage this type of insight, the booth level data from election results can also help to identify geographic regions within a broader community that might have a little bit more of a tendency to support and tendency to adopt this type of technology. We also found that participants who had solar panels installed on their rooftops and who had common or reported having common or major power outages were also expressing a greater interest in joining, potentially reflecting the fact that certainly for those with a solar panel, they were looking for ways of further being able to leverage the financial investment that they'd made. And I think that there were broader concerns around what feed-in tariffs would look like among the participants that we sampled for those that had solar panels. And so I think for those participants, it was very much a means of being able to maximize the financial returns from a previous financial investment that they'd made in this space, really with a concern around whether the feed-in tariffs might move in the future. For those that had common and or major power outages, I think this technology was very much seen as a way of being able to potentially sidestep or to address the frequency or the intermittency of the power connection that they'd sometimes had. What we then started to do is look at the broader brand image around Project Edge. We were looking not only around tangible, concrete, rational variables, like whether it was perceived as being expensive or dependable, but also around some of those emotional attributes as well, because so much of the decision making that we make is based not only around the cognitive and the rational, but also the emotional. And what we found is that there were two broad clusters of attributes that were seen as being more representative of Project Edge. The first one, and perhaps no surprise to all of us on the line here, is that it was seen as being a particularly innovative form of technology. And that was the standout attribute in terms of all the attributes that we're looking. From a statistical significance point of view, this one was higher than all the other ones that we're looking at. We then found a second group of variables, though, that although they were all similar to each other from a cluster point of view, they were far higher than the other variables that we're looking at. And these were the attributes of being exciting, being expensive, and being dependable. Just really want to call out the fact that we identified expensive as being one of those attributes. If you remember back a few moments ago when I was talking about the summary that we presented to participants, we didn't make any reference to how what the cost of this technology would actually look like to adopt. And so I think it broadly recognizes and reflects the fact that participants who are looking at this technology, even if we're not necessarily talking about issues of discrete price points, are still seeing it as being expensive. And I think that probably reflects, in particular, perceptions of household batteries within the broader community and the perception that they are an expensive form of technology. So something I think that very much needs to be looked at and recognized for some of that broader branding activity around how we can better pitch and present VPPs and Project Edge moving forward. We then started to also look at discrete motivations for joining. Now, all of these motivations that we were examining were having at least somewhat of a motivating influence. The scale that we were looking at was ranging from 1, not at all motivating, to 5, very motivating. And as you can see from the averages that we've got presented on the bar charts for each of these motivations, they were all 3 or above, which means that every single one of these motivations or potential motivations were perceived as being at least somewhat motivating. We found, though, that there was one motivator that stood head and shoulders above the others, and that was the motivation of being able to decrease power bills. And certainly in terms of the broader media conversation that's been taking place over the last week or so around the potential for power bills to be increasing, particularly up and down the seaboard, the southeast seaboard, we would potentially see that as being a motivator that could have, even though we're only doing this piece of research at the back end of last year or the start of this year, could potentially have increased in the interim. In terms of concerns about joining, there was one factor that was particularly concerning for participants, and that was the cost of buying solar panels and or a battery. It isn't to say that the other factors that we examined didn't have a particular potential barrier, but the costs of adoption were really recognised as being a potential barrier and a potential concern for joining. What we then did is looked at all of those variables together to really try to understand which of these variables had the biggest influence, both on having a favourable opinion towards Project Edge, as well as also interest in joining. And you can see the beta values and whether they had a positive or negative influence in the table here, but I really wanted to draw attention to a couple of broader findings. The first is that overall, the biggest factor, the one that had the greatest influence in both having a favourable opinion as well as also interest in joining, was perceiving Project Edge as exciting. And I think this is really interesting. It is an emotional perception that people are having, and it really speaks to and reinforces the fact that sometimes these emotional factors can have a really important influence on how people are approaching and perceiving VPPs like Project Edge, but also their interest in joining. The other element, though, is a consistent thread around financial issues and financial concerns. And this is something that flows both ways. We can see here from a potential motivation that people were seeing those downstream longer term benefits for decreasing power bills as being a real motivator for adopting and also for having a favourable opinion around Project Edge. But at the same time, there were some broader hip pocket concerns around the expense of actually purchasing a VPP like Project Edge. We can see that expensive was having a negative influence and having a favourable opinion towards Project Edge. And we can also see that cost of buying solar panels and or batteries, that the concerns around that were also having a negative influence on intention to join Project Edge as well. And so I think it's really speaking to the fundamental importance of some of those financial barriers and those financial issues for people's perceptions and intentions to join. And this is a thread that will come through repeatedly through a lot of the results that I'll be presenting over the remainder of the webinar. We then started to go a little bit more specific into how people were wanting to have the aggregator household relationship managed. What we've got here is the overall preference that participants had for who should manage the trading criteria that would ultimately sit around the VPP. We can see that 2/3 were wanting their household to manage those trading criteria, whereas 1/3 were wanting the aggregator to manage those criteria. There was a really interesting nuance, though, when we started to split our participants up into two different groups, those who were not at all or only slightly interested in joining versus those who were very or extremely interested in joining. And what we can see here is that the proportion of participants who were wanting or who were comfortable with having the aggregator managing those transactions was far higher for those who were very or extremely interested. And we think that this result is very much driven by a perception of, or perhaps a greater propensity to trust energy organisations or aggregators for those who were very or extremely interested. We couldn't directly address or assess issues of trust per se because most participants didn't know who Project Edge were. They wouldn't understand or appreciate or know the aggregator who would be sitting between themselves and the broader grid. And so very hard to be able to get an accurate assessment of issues of trust in that situation. But I think this still points to the fact that we have potential people who might have a greater trust propensity for a whole range of different reasons, and certainly are very much more comfortable with having an aggregator manage those trading preferences. We also looked at the proportion of the battery that participants were prepared to have set aside, broadly speaking, for trading related purposes. And what we found is that 3/4 of our participants were prepared to have 60% or more of their battery set aside for trading related activity. Now, a few really interesting caveats for this. We will start to see a slightly different picture emerge a little bit later on in the webinar amongst participants who actually have a battery themselves currently installed. And I think this very much speaks to the fact that we're dealing here, for this particular set of findings, with a group of participants that, for them, batteries are still somewhat of a hypotheticality. They haven't had a direct exposure to it. They might understand it in the abstract, but they haven't actually had that opportunity to understand the broader benefits that batteries can provide. And they certainly haven't had the opportunity to see and to interact with it in a really hands-on way. And so I think that that's a really important caveat for the interpretation of these results. But nevertheless, it does suggest that for all of those caveats in mind, 3/4 of participants were prepared to have a pretty significant proportion of their batteries set aside for trading related activities. Again, it really reinforces the fact that many of these participants were really trying to find ways of being able to maximize the financial benefit that they would be able to extract from signing up to a program like Project Edge. We then also started to delve into information preferences. So after a particular transaction had taken place, what was the type of information that participants would be interested in receiving? We can see here that almost 90% of participants were wanting to understand how much money they were making after each sale, after every trade. And again, really reinforces the primacy of those financial elements, those financial attributes in the perceptions and decision-making processes that sit around Project Edge in their minds. We also had about 50% of participants wanting to see the environmental benefit arising from each sale, and about 40% who were wanting to see who were the recipients of the power that they'd actually sold. We started to find, though, that there was, again, a very interesting deviation that was taking place once we started to compare those who were not at all or slightly interested in joining versus those who were very or extremely interested in joining. And what we can see here is that those who were very or extremely interested in joining were far more likely to want to receive information about the environmental benefits arising from each trade. And I think that this, again, reinforces what I was echoing a few slides ago around that progressive political identity, and with it often a heightened interest and concern around environmental issues. But it also starts to provide a broader insight here that the information preferences that people are starting to talk to really starts to shed light on some of the potential motivators that they would have for joining VPPs like Project Edge. If they're interested in receiving information about it, it provides a bit of an interesting proxy for some of those broader motivational reasons that they might have for joining. So that was very much a quick overview of some of the top line findings from potential residential customers. There's much more information, as I was mentioning at the start of the webinar, involved or contained within the report. And so I encourage you to delve into the detail and to have a bit of a look if you're interested in getting a little bit more of a handle of where potential customers might be perceiving VPPs and Project Edge. I'm now going to segue to a second piece of research that we conducted, and this one is focusing around current residential battery owners, so those that have actually purchased or installed a battery predominantly. We had 19 participants involved in this piece of research across 16 households, and because it was a much smaller group, we were using a qualitative or an interview-based approach to really go for a deep dive into where their mindsets are at, where their perceptions are, and why they actually decided to adopt Project Edge or to join Project Edge. We also, though, had a really small group of participants who had considered purchasing a battery as part of joining Project Edge, but ultimately decided not to do so. And we thought it was particularly important to also include that particular group within this broader piece of research, because it starts to shed light not only on those who have decided to join Project Edge, but also for those that did a really deep consideration, but ultimately decided not to join. And between these two groupings, it really starts to help paint a broader picture for some of the reasons why people might be interested in joining. Also, just a brief note, when we conducted these interviews, the marketplace mechanism hadn't been implemented at that stage, and so participants hadn't had that opportunity to understand what the potential financial returns would be as a result of trading energy from their batteries, etc. So the very first thing that we're really wanting to understand is why these participants had decided to join Project Edge. And we had three really strong factors that were coming through: community, sustainability, and energy self-sufficiency. And I'll spend a little bit of time going through these in a little bit more detail. I've also provided some indicative quotes just to paint a little bit more of a picture for what some of these motivational factors were and what they looked like. One of the big things that we were really starting to identify is that participants, or the participants that we interviewed, had a really strong connection to their community. They were seeing the ability to benefit the community through Project Edge as being a really strong potential motivation for joining as a result. And those are a number of different ways through which this was manifested. For some people, such as through this indicative quote that I've got up here on the screen, it was really about being able to support this broader social movement. They saw themselves as being able to afford solar panels and being able to afford batteries. And so the ability to be able to have energy that could be shared with their broader community was something that really resonated with them. They were seeing it as a way of being able to bring about that broader almost sense of patronage to their local community. A slightly different manifestation around this community motivation was around those participants who were excited by the ability to come together, for people to come together as a collective and to be able to bring about broader sustainability and environmental outcomes. And I think that this really speaks to the fact that these factors here that I've mentioned and pulled out, community, sustainability, and energy self-sufficiency, they're often really deeply interrelated. It's sometimes helpful to look at these perhaps less as standalones and instead more as being this web of motivations that was really driving those decisions for these participants to join Project Edge. In terms of that sustainability piece, we had a lot of participants who were talking about their broader concerns of climate change and the fact that if they could join a program like Project Edge, it was seen as a way that they could actually do something tangible to bring about a small but discrete activity to really try to help reduce both their climate change impacts, but also those of their broader community. And that was certainly something that we were seeing across a very large proportion of the participants that we interviewed for this form of research. The final really strong theme that we had for motivators was around energy self-sufficiency. We had participants who were speaking about what would happen for their household appliances or for their utilities if the power went out. And this particular quote really, I think, speaks to this quite nicely. For this particular participant, they didn't have access to their water when the power went out. And so for that reason, having a battery was really quite a fundamental element for them because it meant that even when the power was out, they could still have flowing water. And so that energy self-sufficiency piece was a really strong element that was coming through. But there were a couple of other elements also sitting within that energy self-sufficiency piece. We were doing these interviews within the Hume region of Victoria, and the Hume region has had certainly a heightened bushfire risk and has had bushfires in the past as well. And so some of the participants were really looking at the potential to have batteries as a way of being able to ensure broader self-sufficiency should a bushfire take place in the future and knock out some of the transmission lines that go through the region, really as a way of being able to safeguard the supply of their electricity more broadly. And so for some of those participants, that was a really strong motivator for joining Project Edge. Now, the financial benefits were very much of secondary importance for the motivation to join. And that was the reason why, was because most of the participants recognized that joining Project Edge couldn't be justified on financial grounds alone. They were able to recognize that the cost of batteries in particular was quite substantial, that the payback period for what they could potentially recoup through Project Edge or by having a battery in general may not necessarily be achieved through the warranty period. And so the financial factors weren't something that was driving the motivation to join. It was those other three elements in particular that I was just speaking to that were really driving the decision to join Project Edge. In terms of barriers to participation, very much echoing the results that we had from the quantitative survey that I was speaking to earlier, cost was seen as the primary barrier to motivation. And there are a couple of different manifestations by which this barrier was talked to by participants. Some were zeroing in particularly around the cost of the batteries being particularly burdensome. Most of our participants were recognizing that the payback period for solar panels often made a huge amount of sense. And so that wasn't the real focus of their cost-related concerns. It was very much around the cost of the battery. And for them, they were looking at that and sort of going, it's going to be quite difficult to potentially afford this in the outset. That being said, they were also speaking around incentives or subsidies as really helping to de-sting those costs, and that without those subsidies or incentives, they may have struggled to potentially have had the cash flow, the available resources to sign up to Project Edge, but those subsidies and incentives had really helped to de-sting some of those initial cost-related concerns that they may otherwise have had. Cost was also very much spoken to for those participants that decided not to join Project Edge, even though they had evaluated it quite considerably in terms of whether or not to join. And the reason why is that they tended to find alternative and more cost-effective solutions that were helping to satisfy their underlying needs. And I've got two examples here, speaking to two slightly different underlying needs and the ways in which they were able to find alternative options to resolve them. The first of these participants was speaking about the fact that for them, the climate change impacts were probably the biggest consideration. And so they could still achieve their climate change related goals by purchasing 100% renewable power, as opposed to necessarily going out and purchasing a battery. And so for this particular participant, that underlying need could be satisfied in a potentially more cost-effective way. For the second participant, they were focusing around energy self-sufficiency in particular, and they were recognizing that there would be other types of solutions, such as a diesel-powered generator, that would be a potentially more cost-effective way for being able to address major blackouts that could be happening in this particular situation every couple of years or so. So for this particular participant, climate change is perhaps a slightly lower priority. It was very much around ensuring the stability of energy supply over the longer term. In terms of perceptions of trading power with members of the local community, this very much resonated with participants, but they were also incredibly clear around the fact that limits should be put in place around when and how trading power should occur. So for many of our participants, they were concerned in particular that the trading process wouldn't have an impact upon themselves as battery owners. And there was a number of ways in which this was referred to by participants. One participant, for example, was speaking about the fact that, yep, trading would be absolutely fine if they were going to be away for a month or so and their battery was still in use. So may as well make use of that resource while they were not having to actually use it for their household day-to-day activities. That being said, when they were at home, it might be a very different set of circumstances. And that's something what was coming through in this second quote that I've got up here around the screen. The fact that you wouldn't want the trading to be taking place in situations when it could have an impact upon themselves as the battery owner. I'm looking out the window outside my house at the moment, and it's a very dull wintry day, and certainly would potentially align with that set of circumstances that is being spoken to by the second participant. And so this very much speaks to the fact that trading would be potentially supported so long as it didn't have an impact upon households. In fact, in many respects, participants often felt a degree of ownership over the power that had been stored within their batteries. It wasn't just that they were feeling ownership around the battery itself, but it was about the power that was stored within the battery and the ability for others to potentially make use of it. And I think this very much potentially speaks to a snapshot in time. As I mentioned at the start of this section, these quotes, these interviews were conducted before participants had had that chance to experience in a hands-on way that trading mechanism. And so potentially their attitudes and their perceptions might change once they can see what that looks like, and once they can see what the financial benefits for engaging in the trading process might start to look like as well. But that being said, it very much speaks to the fact that for those participants that do currently have batteries, there is a quite degree of possessiveness around who can use it, how it's used, and particularly making sure that trading takes place only if it doesn't have an impact upon households themselves. In terms of trust around aggregation and of organisations that might be sitting between themselves and within the broader market, energy marketplace, there was a degree of cynicism and doubt around the motives of potential for-profit companies. Participants were often perceiving that a commercial organisation that was wanting to engage with the trading process may not necessarily be always acting with the best interests of households at heart. And so they would be very much looking for either safeguards or alternatively for not-for-profit companies or local energy companies to potentially be acting in that aggregator capacity as a means of being able to allay some of those concerns, some of those issues of trust and doubt. Others were more trusting, so long as fair compensation would be provided by the aggregator. So really looking to make sure that if they were not going to be using a stored battery power at a particular point of time because it was going to be engaged within a trading process, that they were not going to be financially disadvantaged from that, and that instead they would be receiving fair and timely compensation for that trading process. And then other participants took a wait and see approach. For them, trust had to be earned over time. And so for them, the jury would potentially be out. They would be taking a wait and see approach, seeing how it goes, giving the benefit of the doubt in the first instance, but waiting to see before they had a really more fixed and firm view around trust, waiting to see what this would start to look like for themselves and for their hip pocket more broadly. I'm now going to segue to the third of the pieces of research that we're looking at, which is looking at potential organisational customers. And we were focusing on two discrete segments. We were focusing upon commercial and industrial organisations, or C&I organisations operating within the Hume region, as well as also elected representatives and staff from 5 local government areas across the Hume region. And so I'll present these results as 2 separate groupings. First, the C and I results, and then the local government results. Although as I go through, you'll see that there are lots of similarities in terms of some of the themes that were emerging from these interviews that we conducted. In terms of the potential C&I customers, they were, broadly speaking, very favourably disposed towards the technology stack underpinning VPPs. They could see a huge range of potential benefits arising from VPPs, particularly around sustainability and energy resilience. The sustainability part was very interesting, I think, for a lot of the participants that we were interviewing, partly from a personal perspective, but a couple of the interviewees that we were talking with were also speaking about the fact that their organizations, their businesses were operating in sectors of the economy where issues of CSR and ESG were really important. And so for them, having that broader potential to achieve sustainability related outcomes was something that was seen in a very favorable light. Energy resilience was also seen as being particularly important, particularly for those organizations where the uninterrupted power of supply was incredibly important for ensuring the ongoing productivity and outputs of the organization. And so in that respect, having something like a VPP, which could start to ensure energy resilience, was seen very positively. 1 or 2 of our interviewees also spoke about the potential relevance of sharing power across dispersed facilities. They were operating in business contexts where the business had facilities that were geographically dispersed. And so the potential for them to be able to share power, or at least have a broader snapshot of how the power across all those different facilities was being used and being able to draw upon better energy consumption insights, all of those things were seen in a very positive light, as was the potential to share power with the community and the potential broader branding related and perceptual related benefits that could potentially come about from that. That being said, all of them were also recognizing that the financial case for installing a VPP was not always clear. For many of the participants, it wasn't seen as necessarily meeting the desired payback period that their boards or that the organisation that they were a part of would be looking for. And there was a degree of variability for what that desired payback period would really be looking like. For some, it was a relatively short period of several years. For others, it was a longer period and potentially reflecting the organisational sector in which or the sector of the economy in which those organisations were parts of. But nevertheless, all of them were wanting to make sure that there was a really clear and concise business case around what the payback period would be for what would be a fairly sizable investment. And for the participants that we were speaking to, virtually all of them were recognising that, in their minds at least, that business case wasn't necessarily clearly elaborated upon for their own organisational context. I'll come back to that point though in a few moments' time, because I think there might be some additional nuances and things that organisations can really try to leverage to start to build up those payback period cases. Participants were also talking about opportunity costs and the fact that, yes, they could potentially make an investment in a VPP, but that would generally come at the expense of another potential opportunity that they could otherwise have put their money towards. And so in that respect, they were looking at this type of adoption motivation very holistically. Yes, we can decide to adopt, but we also need to recognise how that would start to play against other potential initiatives that we could be looking at introducing within our organisation, which is going to give biggest bang for buck, which is going to make most strategic sense for the organisation. And some participants also spoke about a potential early adopter tax, where when you are relatively early on the adoption curve, there's always the potential that the technology might shift or change. And so there are potentially heightened risks associated with that adoption when you are at the left-hand side of that adoption curve. The final issue that participants were speaking about from a financial perspective were around cash flow constraints. And they were seeing that from an organisational perspective, it was often hard for them to be able to make very large upfront purchases when the size of the investment was often relatively substantial. So even if the business case made sense and they could find organisational support for it, if there was a large upfront purchase that was required to adopt a VPP, that would potentially provide challenges for them to be able to advocate for that within the organisational context. We then asked participants what would be some factors that could potentially accelerate VPP adoption within the organisational context, and participants spoke to a number of potential things. The first was around sweetening the deal. So if there was grants that were available, whether from broader organisations or from government, that would potentially help to defray and to de-sting some of those financial cost-related concerns, as well as also if there was a really strong sense of community support for this type of initiative and activity, because it could have broader CSR and branding type implications for the communities that they were seeking to serve. Participants also spoke about having successful case studies to emulate, that if they could start to see other organisations within their context, within their sector that had adopted a VPP, it started to provide a pathway to demonstrating both the technical feasibility for introducing it and the potential benefits that might come for the organisation, but also helping to further bolster the financial case for making this type of investment. And I think that this is where there's some potential opportunities, particularly around the demonstration of the financial case. Once organisations start to potentially add financial or attach financial value to things like ensuring the stability of electricity supply, the financial case might potentially start to shift and change. If it's looking purely at it from a bottom line perspective of money in, money out, from a bills perspective, what's my power bill and how would a VPP reduce my power bill? Looked at very from a very narrow perspective, it might be harder to build that financial case, but being able to look at the broader potential benefits that could arise and being able to put financial values for those broader benefits really starts to help paint that picture potentially for how the investment might still be able to justify the business investment. And I think that having those case studies can really help to reinforce some of those broader messages. The third thing that our interviewees were talking to was the importance of identifying champions within the organisation. Many of them were parts or were members of SMEs, small and medium-sized businesses. And within that particular context, often one or two people that were strong advocates within the organisation and who had clout from a board perspective or with the managing director or with the owner could often have a really important impact in terms of the type of technologies, the type of solutions that were being sought by the organisation to invest. And so being able to identify those champions within the organization could really help to pass that threshold of whether or not VPPs would be adopted. We then also had a look at LGAs, local government areas, and really trying to understand the extent to which LGAs would both be interested in adopting VPPs in their own right, but also more broadly, the extent to which they would be happy to take a leadership position to advocate for this type of technology within their broader local communities. And one of the things that we're really identifying across that interview, across these interviews, is that decision-making requires alignment across what I'll call here the 4 Ps: policy, price, personality, and public. And if any one of those Ps is not present, then it's very unlikely that the LGA would invest in a technology like VPPs. So in terms of policy, LGAs are obviously sitting within a very complex bureaucracy and very complex decision-making, and procurement decisions increasingly must be aligned with the broader strategy, the broader initiatives, the broader policies that have been put forward by the LGA. And so the people that we were speaking with were being very clear that an LGA would be unlikely to make an investment in this particular space unless there was a really clear alignment between a VPP like Project Edge and with broader policies that have been promulgated by the LGA. Issues of price were also seen as being an issue, and this was very much ensuring that they were able to provide value for money for their constituents, for their ratepayers, really wanting to make sure that the business case was very clear and had been well and truly developed up so that it would be a defensible investment that they would be making, because they are ultimately accountable to ratepayers, to voters. And if they don't have that accountability from a price perspective, then there are potential broader term implications that can arise. They were also speaking, though, around, again, issues of personality and the fact that different councillors in particular can have a really strong impact in terms of the investment decisions or the priorities that an LGA was actually starting to adopt and to pursue. And so really wanting to reinforce through these interviews that issues of personality can be incredibly important for a lot of these decision-making processes. And then the final one is around public. They wanted to make sure that this type of decision making was broadly consistent with issues of concern, issues of consideration within the public that they were serving. That if there was a misalignment there, that the public were not interested, that their constituents were not interested, then there would be a far greater hurdle to actually going out and investing in something like a VPP. They saw, however, that LGAs could provide soft leadership in a number of other ways. And the easiest that was spoken to by the interviewees we were talking to were around supporting local community energy groups in terms of helping them to advocate for different forms of technology that could help to address issues of climate change or energy resilience or any of those other types of attributes that VPPs can potentially contribute to. And in that respect, I think LGAs were quite positively disposed towards providing broader support for those local community energy groups and really helping to have those energy groups come together and to identify within those groupings issues that would be of relevance for the local community and for the needs of that community. More difficult, but certainly not impossible, and there are examples for other forms of renewable energy technologies across Victorian LGAs, was around facilitating bulk buy arrangements. And so this would be where they're not necessarily purchasing things, but they might be able to help provide some of that back-end administration support and the political leadership and those types of things to facilitate that bulk buy arrangement. And again, that could be something that might be of potential relationship with things like VPPs. In terms of strategies for accelerating VPP adoption, the interviewees that we spoke to identified 4 broad points that could be examined. The first would be finding champions in local government, whether that's among the councillors or among the professional members that sit within the bureaucracies of LGA. Finding those local champions to advocate for this technology can be really helpful. Again, having successful case studies to emulate helps to de-risk this type of investment decision as well, because if they can see that it has worked for other LGAs or other comparable organizations, it really starts to demonstrate that there are broader benefits that can be achieved. And it also demonstrates the potential pathways to adoption, but also the things that need to potentially be avoided to de-risk that decision further. In a similar de-risking vein, receiving support from other tiers of government was also seen as important, whether that be through grant funding or whether that be through more intangible demonstrations of support. Because again, it then helps to de-risk that decision within the LGA context and helps to make sure that there's less likely to be pushback from constituents and from members of the public more broadly. And then the final one, and speaking of issues of public, is around having active community engagement. If there's a really strong, motivated group of local members, local constituents who are actively engaged within this area, who are actively pushing for solutions in this particular space, then that's certainly something that can help with the issues of adoption around VPPs. So that's a very brief overview of the research that we've conducted. I'll just quickly go through next steps for some of the additional plans for additional research that we'll be conducting, as well as how you can get further information if you're interested. So what we're currently doing at the moment is conducting a literature review of existing customer insights research. There's been a huge amount of research that's been done across Australia over the last few years. And what we're wanting to do is do 2 things. First of all, stock take. What do we know? And what we're not wanting to replicate things where there's already a really solid evidence base. So what is it that we know about from the existing customer insights research? But also, and perhaps even more importantly, what are the gaps that exist? What are the things that we don't know? What are the things that we need to better understand so that we can then provide deeper insights that can help to support broader customer adoption of technologies like VPPs? And so that's a piece of work that we're doing literally as we speak, and really excited to be able to bring that to fruition so that hopefully the insights will be of relevance in general, but also in particular, we can then start to structure our future research to start to address some of those gaps that we identified. In terms of some of those additional pieces of research, we'll be doing some further work around examining the perceptions and decision-making processes that sit around potential and actual Project Edge customers, and very much informed by some of those gaps that we identified. We're also really keen to delve deeper into how customers make decisions at critical times for grid security. We saw a moment ago through some of those qualitative findings that some of the people who already have batteries are very possessive of their stored power, but there are also going to be situations where ideally we would have those people engaging in trades to be able to form or to support broader grid security outcomes. So what is their decision making around that? What are their perceptions, and are there things that we can do to sweeten the deal or make them feel far more confident and comfortable in engaging in trades during those very critical periods of time? And in a related vein, what do we need to do to better understand compensation, perceptions of value, and how we can make sure that there is perceived fairness of value flows between aggregators and customers? Because it isn't just about encouraging the adoption of VPPs like Project Edge, we also want to make sure that from a retention point of view, people are here for the long journey. And the only way that we can do that is by ensuring that people are comfortable and confident and trusting around the flow of value between aggregators and customers. In terms of further information, the reports that we'll be producing, there's already some that are available up on this website, and we'll be having more of our reports coming through and being shared through this particular website as well. So really do encourage you to check in on that periodically, and there's a whole range of other information that is currently available through that link as well. Anoop was talking right at the very start around some of those technical elements, and so there's some really fascinating work that's been produced by other teams, which is also available through that site. If you've got any other broader queries though about the research though, please email me at any time. I've got my email address up on the slide. Very happy to share with you any insights or thoughts, have a conversation. Please do reach out. One of the things that we're very keen to try and do is ensure that we are providing a broad platform for knowledge sharing and dissemination, and that we're able to hopefully leverage these findings to support the broader sector in encouraging the adoption of DERs and VPPs. And so very keen to have follow-up conversations if that would be of interest. And so without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and move across to the question component. If people would have any questions, I'll have a look to see if there's anything in the chat box. Otherwise, please feel free to put your hand up and then we can go through for live Q&As as well. So I can see, Kevin, in terms of number of respondents in each group, yes, we've got that information in the report. We didn't provide it in the presentation just because it would otherwise probably be lots of information in those graphs. But yes, we do have number of respondents across those groups included in the report as well. In terms, Nicholas, of the number of CNI users who were interviewed, we were looking just at 5 organisations, 5 CNI organisations. So it's a very small capture for CNIs. And I suppose that the challenge from CNI decision making is that each business, each organisation has a very different sense of what's important for their organisational context. And so in that respect, there's probably further work that needs to be done to delve into decision making around different sectors of the CNI cohort. Ian, I can see that you've got your hand up.
Yeah, so from KPMG, I'm just wondering, within the study, was there a relief from curtailment of rooftop PV as part of the VPP? And was that a positive outcome? I didn't see it reflected in any of the questions asked, but I think curtailment in my mind is certainly one of the biggest issues for most PV users, and that's what driving towards a VPP and battery, etc.
Absolutely. I didn't present the results in the presentation, but we do have a segment focusing around the perceptions of solar panel owners in particular, and issues of perceived curtailment in the future, as well as also potential drop-off in the feed-in tariffs as well. And yes, there were a broad range of concerns among that particular cohort. We didn't have huge numbers to be able to have the strength of the confidence to see to what extent that predicted intention or favourable attitudes, but certainly from a descriptive perspective, just in terms of the proportion from memory, and don't quote me on this, but from memory it was around 50% or so of the solar panel owners who were expressing pretty strong concerns around those types of issues.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Josh? Well, we have till 3:30. We certainly don't need to take all of that time, and I think Josh might be keen to take a breath or two after that marathon session. On behalf of the EDGE program, I do want to thank all of those who have attended, and of course, Josh and the Better Consumption Lab at Deakin, the team there who've done so much of the groundwork. And as Josh indicated in the last few slides, there is more work in this space to be done before the project is completed. And things I'll also note, that question just now in relation to the sort of the perceived value of sort of removal or reduction of curtailment. In addition to sort of the customer side of things that this analysis that Josh and his team are doing will capture, some of that will also be addressed in the cost benefit analysis, where the application of dynamic operating envelopes as part of the marketplace, what value that it might provide. So I'm not sure if apologies, I didn't catch the name of the person I think from KPMG, who just asked that question. So there will be some of that in the other sort of findings and documents that we publish as well.
Thanks, Anoop. No, it was Ian Boak from KPMG. So, but thanks. It's good to know that the there's a lot of work going on in that space with respect to I guess also getting consumers educated as to what a DOE is, right? And how does it benefit them or harm them potentially in the future, which is I guess something I was looking for in this presentation, but I'm sure it's follow-on work.
Absolutely, and it has come through from these surveys and other engagement with consumers and to begin with in the human region, but some of this will be transferable. Is there's varying understanding of everything from feed-in tariff to how NEM works. So when we start talking about dynamic operating envelopes, there's a fair bit there in sort of engagement and education before we start getting people thinking about how that can provide value to them. And so that's certainly a challenge. While we won't solve it in a small trial, we'll hopefully try to inform some of the thinking around that at scale. I'm conscious Nick and John Tennyson are here from AEMO and AusNet, leads on the program. Anything to add?
Just to respond to Ian, also to enlarge on what you were saying, Anoop, I think, Ian, there's also a webinar session on more broadly on the interim report on Thursday, and if you've managed to sort of got an invite to that, but that'll shed a little bit more light around some of the operating envelope work, and looking at how one treats sort of constraints, if you like. I mean, there is a lot more to be done, as Anoop pointed out, in the trial. We're kind of looking forward to it already. The sort of some of the work that we've been doing, that the University of Melbourne have been doing around the operating envelope and the assessment, or the sort of different methodologies that one can apply to allocate access to the available network capacity. This is a really interesting, and there's a lot of sort of industry thinking to say, well, it needs to, in a regulatory sense, needs to be fair, it needs to be equitable. It's kind of really interesting, some of the results that are coming out there, that in fact some of those fairness attributes actually act against the national electricity objective. So it's a very interesting space. So there's a lot more exciting stuff to come. So thanks.
Thanks, Anoop. The bit I'd add for you, Ian, around the education of customers and that sort of thing is, the next phase of the work Josh and the team are focusing on also looks at, what's going to influence decision making, and one of those aspects, or what are those non-monetary aspects? So the amount of education, the amount of communication in real time about what's going on with their device when it's being used, all of those are aspects we're keen to understand as well. So there may be that some of your early adopters, like I think we had a few of these in this study, want more information, more education, but there might be quite a large majority of consumers that, if there's just a compelling product that's easy to understand and they can see how they'll be benefited from it, maybe there's not that much education needed across the whole spectrum of customer types. So that's going to be, I'm really interested too to see how those findings come out.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I don't want to hog the show, but I probably am. Just one of the things I picked up is that 2/3 of the customers would prefer to have control over maybe the set points. I'm not too sure what that is. That to me was a fairly interesting finding, is that, maybe there's a trust with the retailers issue, but, if that's a pervasive sentiment, you're going to have a fairly sophisticated set and forget system which passes information, and maybe not have an aggregator, which to me was, I think, a fairly surprising outcome. Any comment on that?
I couldn't agree with you more. I think that it's going to come down to what the choices are that are presented to customers, and the way that I'd probably almost be looking for a metaphor to actually start to consider what that might start to look like, would be our superannuation. Incredibly complex, but they've been able to find ways, they've been able to have broad trading preferences or broad preferences for how those investment decisions for superannuation take place, something that might still provide a degree of high level choice and control for customers without getting down into the weeds. And that's only one potential way of being able to structure this. Whether that's what customers are ultimately wanting, something that we'll be able to delve into in the next rounds of research. But that's from a starting position, a potential way of still being able to give customers a degree of control without getting so far into the weeds that, particularly for those that don't want to understand the ins and outs of trading mechanics, still gives them enough control, but not enough for them to become overwhelmed by.
Yeah, and from the Mondo perspective, I'll absolutely second that, and I love that analogy because it's very much like that. So Mondo is the principal aggregator, so there are other aggregators in the wings about to join in the next phase of the trial. The Mondo team offers customers a platform where that cognitive burden of engaging with market arrangements is manageable. And arguably enjoyable. So you can see how much carbon potentially has been taken out because of your local generation. What's happening instantaneously with your solar, things like that for those who want to be engaged and want the app running on their phone or computer screen. And for others, it's set and forget. And there are some key elements there, like, a toggle that says, I will always have enough charge to see me through X hours. Some minimum capacity that I'll maintain on my battery for those days when something goes bad. It is a challenge, and Ian, to your point of whether that means an aggregator may not be required. I think certainly from the Mondo perspective, I think there's a service there that an aggregator can offer. Eventually, you could see that complete disintermediation where it's all automatic and AI based. But currently, I think there is a valued service in the platform and the support and that sort of thing that an aggregator could offer over and above the sort of the intelligence and forecasting and clever trading.
Excellent.
Well, if there are no further questions, I might hand over to Rachel from the AEMO stakeholder team, who's been very kind in helping with the logistics and managing all of these interactions. Rachel, next.
Absolutely. Thank you very, very much, Anoop. I'd like to thank you, Josh, again for that wonderful presentation. So just a reminder to everyone that after this meeting, the recording will be available on the AEMO website within the next week, as well as the slides that Josh presented. So they'll be ready for everyone to digest again. And also just a reminder that we have, as John mentioned, our public interim report webinar from 2 to 3:30 p.m. On Teams. If you don't have an invite, please email the Project Edge email box, which is edge@aemo.com.au, and I will happily forward that on to you. Thank you to all the project participants. This was a fantastic webinar. It was great to hear all of our findings for Project Edge. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Josh.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Josh.